Ethan Callahan raised his rifle and aimed it straight at the woman climbing down from the wagon. "Whoever sent you, turn that wagon around and don't stop till you hit the county line." She didn't flinch. She set her suitcase in the dust, lifted a folded letter, and looked him dead in the eye. "My father said you needed a wife." The barrel stayed level, but his hands went cold around it. Because he knew that handwriting. He knew that name. And a debt he'd carried for 11 years suddenly had a face standing at his gate. Before we go on, if you love stories about strong women, second chances, and the kind of love that arrives when you've stopped believing it, ever will hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end. And do me one small favor. Friend, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rifle didn't move for a long moment. Neither did she. "Ma'am," Ethan said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it. "I don't know what game your daddy was playing, but I got no use for a wife. I got no use for anybody. So I'll ask you civil one time. Get back on that wagon." The driver up on the bench shifted his reins, nervous, ready to bolt. Margaret Whitmore didn't so much as glance at him. She kept her eyes on Ethan, and she kept that letter held out in front of her like it was a shield made of paper. "His name was Samuel Whitmore," she said. "You'll want to lower that gun before I say the rest, Mr. Callahan. My father wouldn't have liked seeing it pointed at me." The name hit him the way a horse kick hits a man in the chest. Slow at first, then all at once stealing the breath clean out of him. Samuel Whitmore. Ethan lowered the rifle, not because she asked, because his arms didn't have the strength to hold it up anymore. "You're lying," he said, but he didn't believe his own words even as they left his mouth. "I buried him in April," Margaret said, "under the cottonwood behind our house the way he wanted. It rained the whole day. The ground was so wet the men could barely dig." She swallowed, and for the first time, something flickered across her face that wasn't steel. "You want me to lie about that, Mr. Callahan? You want me to make it prettier?" Ethan stared at her. She was not what the town would call a beautiful woman. He registered that the way a man registers weather without judgment. Just fact. She was heavy-set, broad through the shoulders, and full in the face, wearing a plain gray traveling dress gone pale at the elbows from too many washings. Her boots were caked to the ankle with 3 states' worth of road. Her hands were the hands of a woman who'd worked, not a woman who'd been kept. But it was her eyes that stopped him, because there was no begging in them. He'd expected begging. Everyone who came to his gate came begging for something: wages or water or a roof. This woman looked at him like she'd already decided she didn't need a single thing he had. "How'd he die?" Ethan asked. "His heart. The doctor said it had been failing for 2 years. He never told me." A pause. "He never told anybody. That was his way." "That was his way," Ethan agreed, quiet. He knew it because he'd known the man. 11 years back, when Ethan was a green fool of 27 who thought he could break any horse and dig any post alone, a section of the corral had come down on him. Timber and a half-broke stallion both. Pinned him at the hip with his leg twisted the wrong direction and his ribs stove in, and there'd been nobody at the ranch that week but a drifter he'd hired for cheap. That drifter was Samuel Whitmore. Any other man would have taken Ethan's horse and Ethan's cash box and left him to die under that timber. Samuel didn't. Samuel dug him out with his bare hands, and a busted shovel set the leg himself and sat up with him 9 nights running while the fever tried to take him. When it broke, Samuel stayed on through the season, asked for no more than his agreed wage, and one gray morning packed his kit and shook Ethan's hand. "You don't owe me nothing," Samuel had said. "A man does what's right or he don't. I did." "I owe you my life," Ethan had answered. "Anything you need, anytime you send word. I don't forget." "I know you don't," Samuel said. "That's the whole reason I stayed." And then the man had ridden off and Ethan had never seen him again. 11 years. Letters twice a year, no more plain and short the way Samuel talked. Ethan kept everyone in a tin box under his bed. Now the man's daughter stood in his yard, and the debt Ethan had sworn he'd never forget was standing there wearing a gray dress and a road-dusted face. "Read me the letter," Ethan said. "You can read it yourself." "I'd rather hear your daddy's words in your voice, ma'am, if you'll oblige me." Something in her softened just at the corners. She unfolded the paper. Her hands were steady, but he saw what it cost her to keep them that way. "Ethan," she read, "if Margaret is standing in front of you, then I am dead, and I am sorry to put this on you in such a way. But you are the only honorable man I ever knew, and I have thought about this a long time. My girl is alone now. The bank has taken the farm. The men in our town look at her the way small men look at a woman without a father to stand behind her. I will not have my daughter delivered up to some fool who'll break her, so I am sending her to you." Margaret's voice held. Ethan gave her credit for that. "I am not asking you to love her," she went on. "Love is not a thing a dying man can arrange. I am asking you to give her a fair chance at a life, a roof, a name that means something, and the freedom to be more than what our town let her be. In return, you will find, if you have the sense God gave you, that she is worth 10 of any woman you'd have chosen on your own. She is smarter than me. She is braver than me. And she has more good in her than this world has ever paid her back for. I saved your life once. I never called that debt. I am calling it now. Take care of my girl. Your friend to the end, Samuel Whitmore." She folded the letter back along its worn creases. For a while there was no sound but the wind coming down off the high grass and the wagon horse stamping. "He shouldn't have sent you," Ethan said at last. "I know. A man's dying wish ain't a rope you can put around another man's neck." "I know that too," Margaret said. "I told him the same thing. I told him you'd more than likely point a gun at me." A ghost of a smile. "I was right about that part." Ethan looked at the rifle in his hand like he'd forgotten he was holding it. He set the stock down against his boot. "I'll pay the driver to carry you to town," he said. "Get you a room at the boarding house. Buy your passage back to Missouri or wherever you aim to go. That squares me with your father as much as any man can be squared. You don't have to marry a stranger, ma'am. That's no kind of life." "And what would I do in Missouri, Mr. Callahan?" Margaret asked. Her voice didn't rise. It went the other way, quiet and level and hard as a creek stone. "The farm is gone. My mother's dead these 6 years. My father's in the ground. The only kin I have left is a cousin in St. Louis who made it clear a heavy spinster with no dowry is a burden he can't afford. So tell me, where is it you imagine I'm going back to?" Ethan had no answer for that. "I didn't come here to be rescued," she went on. "I want that plain between us before you say another word. My father wrote that letter to save me, and I let him write it because it eased his dying. But I didn't ride 400 miles to fall at your feet and thank you for a handout." She lifted her chin. "I came with a proposal, a business proposal, and I'd be obliged if you'd hear it standing up like a man instead of shooing me off like a stray dog." Nobody had spoken to Ethan Callahan like that in years. The hands who worked his cattle were too scared of losing their pay. The town was too busy whispering. His dead wife's people wouldn't say his name at all. "All right," he said slowly. "Say your piece." "May I sit? I've been 3 days on that bench, and I can't feel the lower half of me." He almost smiled. He caught it before it got loose. "There's a bench on the porch." She walked past him toward the house, and he noticed she didn't ask him to carry the suitcase, and she didn't wait to see if he'd offer. She picked it up herself and carried it, and there was something in the plain fact of that which he'd think about later, long after the light went down. They sat on the porch, a careful distance between them. "Here's the truth of my situation," Margaret said. "I have no money. I have no home. I have no man to speak for me. And in this country that means I have nothing, no matter what's in my head. But I have skills, Mr. Callahan, and they are not the skills your town would credit a woman like me for having." "What skills?" "Numbers, ledgers, contracts." My father couldn't read past a Bible verse. God rest him, but I ran the accounts of our farm from the age of 14. When the drought came in 78 and every other farm in our county went under, ours held on 2 years longer than it should have, and that was me. Not luck. Me. She looked at him. You run cattle. You've got hundreds of head and hundreds of acres. Tell me honest. Do you know to the dollar whether your ranch made money last year or lost it? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. I know cattle, he said. That's not what I asked. I keep books. Where? He said nothing. That's what I thought, Margaret said not unkindly. You keep them in your head and in a drawer full of loose paper, and you tell yourself that's the same as knowing. It ain't. A man can work himself into the grave on a ranch that's quietly bleeding out and never know it till the bank does it for him. She let that sit. I can find every hole your money's leaking through. I'd stake my life on it. Give me your records in a month and I'll show you things about your own ranch that'll turn your hair white. And in return, you give me your name, a roof, and a fair share of what we build. Not charity, a partnership. I'll earn every meal I eat under your roof, and I'll earn it in a way that makes you richer, not poorer. She folded her hands in her lap. You marry me, Mr. Callahan, because your ranch needs a mind like mine, and I marry you because a married woman in this country can walk into a bank and a feed store and a land office and be listened to where a spinster can't get the time of day. We each have something the other needs. That's not romance. That's arithmetic. And arithmetic I trust. Ethan sat back. In all his imagining of who might come to his gate, he had never once imagined this. You understand what this town'll say, he said. I have a fair idea. They'll say I married a poor heavy woman from another state because I couldn't do no better. They'll say you married a lonesome old rancher for his land. They'll say it to your face, some of 'em, and behind your back the rest. His jaw tightened. The wealthy folk in the valley'll mock you. The church women'll whisper about you at the mercantile. You won't get one kind word out of Willow Creek, ma'am, not for a long while, maybe never. You sure you want to walk into that? Margaret was quiet a moment. Mr. Callahan, she said, I have been mocked my whole life for the size of my body and the plainness of my face. There is not a cruel word in this valley I haven't already heard shouted at me in another. I stopped bleeding from those cuts a long time ago. She looked out over his land, and for the first time, her voice carried something underneath it, something old and worn smooth. What I've never had is a place that was mine, a thing I built with my own hands that nobody could take because they decided I didn't deserve it. That's what I'm asking you for, not love, not even friendship if you can't spare it. Just a fair chance to build something and the protection of a name while I do it. Ethan looked at her a long time. Your daddy was the finest man I ever knew, he said finally. He was. He said you're worth 10 of any woman I'd have chosen. He was my father. He was obligated to say it. He wasn't a man who said things he didn't mean. Ethan stood. He walked to the edge of the porch and stared out at the fence line at the cattle strung across the far grass like brown stitches. I made him a promise once. Told him anything he needed any time I'd give it. I meant it 11 years ago, and I mean it now. He turned back to her. But I need you to hear me on one thing, and hear me clear because I won't say it twice. I'm listening. This is a partnership, nothing more. I lost a wife once, ma'am, and I buried more than her when she went in the ground. I don't have it in me to love again, and I won't pretend to, and I won't have you waiting on it neither. You'll have your own room, your own life. You'll be my wife in name and in business and in nothing else. Unless a day comes you choose different, and I'd wager it won't. You'll always have a choice. Every day. If you wake up and want to leave, I'll put money in your hand and take you to the train myself, and there'll be no hard feelings. That's the only way I'll do this. You understand me? Margaret held his gaze. I understand you fine, she said, and I'll tell you something back so we're square. She stood too slow, one hand on the porch rail. I'm not looking to love you either, Mr. Callahan. I've buried my hopes about being loved same as you buried yours. So we'll suit each other well enough. Two people who've stopped waiting for the thing they were told they'd never deserve. She put out her hand plain and square. Partners. Ethan looked at the offered hand. Then he took it. Her grip was firm, warm, steadier than his own. Partners, he said. They stood a moment with their hands clasped, two strangers bound by a dead man's word, and neither one of them had the faintest notion that they'd just shaken hands on the thing that would remake both their lives. There's a preacher in town, Ethan said, letting go. Reverend Hollis. He'll do it quiet if I ask, day after tomorrow. That soon. You want to spend 2 weeks giving this valley time to talk you out of it? No, Margaret said. I don't reckon I do. Then day after tomorrow. He hesitated. There's a room off the kitchen. Was meant for a housekeeper, only I never kept one. Bed's decent. Lock works. You'll have your privacy. Thank you. Don't thank me. It's part of the deal. He picked up her suitcase before she could reach it, and he saw the surprise cross her face quick as a bird. I ain't gonna carry it every day, he said gruffly. But you rode 3 days on a bench. Least I can do is get it to the door. She let him. That was its own kind of trust, and he knew it, and he was quietly grateful she'd given it. The driver got his pay and turned the wagon and rattled off toward town, and Ethan knew before the dust settled that the man would have the whole thing spread across every saloon in Willow Creek by supper. The lonely Callahan taking a wife. A heavy stranger with a suitcase. Let them talk. Let them talk themselves hoarse. Inside the house was clean but bare, the way a house gets when one man lives in it, and stopped caring about anything but function years ago. Margaret took it in without comment. She didn't wrinkle her nose at the dust in the corners or the single chair at the long table built for a family that never came. She just looked, and Ethan had the uncomfortable feeling she was reading the house the way she'd offered to read his ledgers, seeing straight through to the truth of it. You cook? He asked to say something. I cook well? I mostly don't. There's beans, some salt pork, coffee. I'll manage. He showed her the room off the kitchen. She set her suitcase on the bed and turned to face him in the doorway. Mr. Callahan, one more thing, and then I'll leave you be tonight. Ethan, he said. If we're to be married Thursday, you may as well call me Ethan. Ethan, then. And I'm Margaret, not Maggie. My mother called me Maggie, and I'd sooner keep it hers. Margaret. She nodded, satisfied. The thing I want to say is this. I know what I look like. I know what you were expecting when you heard Sam Whitmore had a daughter to marry off, and it wasn't me. So I'll make you a promise since you made me one. She stood very straight. I will never embarrass you. I will never give this town a true thing to say against me. Whatever they whisper, it'll be a lie, and lies wear thin in time. And I will work harder than any hand you've ever hired, and I will make this ranch worth more with me in it than it ever was without me. That's my promise. You'll never be sorry you kept your word to my father. I'll see to that. Ethan stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and he didn't know what to say to a woman like that, so he said the only true thing he had. Your daddy raised you right, Margaret. He raised me the only way he knew how, she said, which was to expect nothing from anybody and be grateful when somebody surprised me. She almost smiled. You surprised me a little today, lowering that gun. Don't make too much of it. I nearly shot you first. You nearly did, she agreed. But you didn't. A man's measured by what he does after the nearly my father used to say. Ethan turned to go, then stopped. Margaret. Yes. Why'd you really come the truth? Not the arithmetic. I heard the arithmetic. Why'd you get on that wagon and ride 400 miles to a man you never met on the word of a father who's gone? She was quiet a long moment, long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. Because he asked me to, she said finally, and because in 29 years he was the only person who ever looked at me and saw somebody worth protecting. When he was dying, the one thing that gave him peace was thinking he'd found a place I'd be safe. I couldn't take that from him, so I promised I'd come. And I keep my promises, Ethan, same as you keep yours. Her voice thickened just slightly, and she mastered it. That's the truth since you asked for it. I came for a dead man's peace. I stayed because I had nowhere else on this earth to go. There's no romance in it, but there's no lie in it either. Ethan nodded slowly. That'll do, he said. That'll do fine. He left her to her room and walked back out into the yard as the light went long and gold across the grass. And he stood there a while with his hands in his pockets and a feeling in his chest he couldn't name. He'd buried his wife 6 years back, Caroline. 26 years old and full of laughter, dead of the fever in a single terrible week. And after her, his heart had gone to stone, and he'd let it. He'd told himself it was easier, safer. A man who loved nothing could lose nothing. And it had worked. God help him, it had worked so well that he'd become the thing the town called him, the loneliest man in the valley, a man who talked to cattle because cattle never left. Then his friend Josiah had cheated him on a land deal and run off with the difference. Then his own brother had borrowed against Ethan's name and vanished east, leaving Ethan to cover the debt. Then the neighbors he'd grown up with had turned cold when Charles Whitaker started buying up the valley, and it got dangerous to be seen taking Ethan's side against him. One by one, everybody Ethan had ever trusted had shown him the same lesson. People come to take, never to give. Trust a man, and he'll bleed you. Love a woman, and she'll die or leave. Better to be alone. Better to want nothing. Better to build the fence high and never open the gate. And now a dead man had reached up out of the ground and opened the gate anyway. Ethan looked back at the house at the lamp Margaret had lit in the little room off the kitchen, a warm yellow square in the fading blue of evening. "You old devil, Sam," he said quietly to the wind and the grass and the memory of the one man who'd never taken a thing from him. "What have you gone and done to me?" Supper that night was the strangest meal Ethan had eaten in 6 years. Margaret found the beans and the salt pork he'd mentioned, and she found, besides a sack of flour going stale and onions sprouting in the cellar, and a heel of hard cheese he'd forgotten he owned, and out of that, nothing. She made a supper that filled the whole house with a smell Ethan hadn't smelled since Caroline was alive. The smell of a kitchen with somebody in it who cared how the food came out. He sat down at the long table across from her in the chair that had stood empty so long the joints creaked when he pulled it. "I only got the one good chair," he said. "I noticed. We'll want another. And a lamp for the table. A person can't read ledgers by one candle." She set the food down and sat. "I'll make a list. There'll be a good many things we need, and most of them cheap. It's astonishing what a ranch can do without when there's a man alone deciding it can do without." Ethan looked at the plate in front of him. It had been a long time since anyone had set a plate in front of him. "You don't have to wait on me," he said. "That ain't the deal. I'm not waiting on you. I'm hungry and I cooked, and it'd be foolish to make 2 trips. She picked up her fork. "Eat, Ethan. It's good. I don't say that to be modest. I say it because it's true, and you'll insult my cooking if you push it around the plate." He ate. It was good. It was better than good. He ate like a man who hadn't known he was starving. "Sam taught you to cook?" he asked. "My mother taught me to cook. Sam taught me everything else." She was quiet a moment, chewing. "He taught me to read when the schoolmaster wouldn't have me because we couldn't pay. Sat with me every night after the fields with a Bible and a stub of pencil till I had my letters. He taught me numbers the same way, only I ran past him quick on numbers, and after a while he'd bring the account book to me instead and say, 'Margaret, tell me if we're ruined this year or only poor.'" She smiled faintly. "He taught me that a person's worth isn't in what folks say about them. It's in what they can do when nobody's watching and there's no reward for doing it right. He lived that, right up to the end." "He did," Ethan said. "Even with me. 9 nights he sat up. No reason to. I couldn't have paid him more than his wage, and he knew it." That was Sam. That was Sam. Ethan set down his fork. "I never got to say thank you. Not proper. He rode off before I was strong enough to do more than shake his hand." His voice went rough. 11 years I've carried that. Never got to square it." Margaret looked at him across the table, and something passed between them that wasn't romance and wasn't friendship, not yet, but was the first thread of something. Understanding. 2 people who'd both loved the same man and both been shaped by him, and both carried him now like a stone in the pocket, heavy and precious at once. "You can square it now," she said gently. "Not with him, with me. Keep your word. Give me a fair chance." That's all he wanted, and it's a debt you can pay in full if you've a mind to. "I've a mind to," Ethan said. They finished the meal in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, and when it was done, Margaret cleared the plates before he could, and washed them at the basin, and Ethan sat at the table, watching a woman move around his kitchen for the first time in 6 years, and he was surprised to find it didn't hurt the way he'd feared it would. It just felt like the house had been holding its breath a long time, and finally let it go. "I'll want your records first thing tomorrow," she said, drying her hands. "All of them. The loose paper, too. The bills you shoved in drawers and the ones you shoved in your head. Everything. It's a mess. Messes are my favorite. There's always something hiding in a mess." She hung the towel. "And Ethan, when we go to town Thursday for the wedding." "What about it?" "They'll stare and they'll talk, and some of them will say cruel things where we can hear hoping to shame us both." She looked at him steady. "I need to know how you'll stand it. Because if you flinch, if you look ashamed of me even once, they'll know they've won and they'll never stop. But if you stand easy like a man who married exactly the woman he meant to, they'll run out of steam faster than you'd think. So which is it going to be? I'd rather know now than find out in front of the church." Ethan stood up from the table. He crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of her, and he was a tall man, and she had to tip her head back a little to hold his eyes, but she held them. "Margaret," he said, "I don't know you but 2 hours. I don't love you, and you don't love me, and we've both said as much. But I'll tell you what I do know." His voice was low and even, and there was iron underneath it. "Your father dug me out from under a corral with his bare hands, and sat up 9 nights so I wouldn't die alone. And any man in that town who says one word against his daughter in my hearing is going to answer to me for it. I won't flinch. I won't look ashamed. Because I'm not. Let them stare. Let them run their mouths. You walk in beside me Thursday with your head up, and I'll walk in beside you with mine up, and we'll let this whole valley choke on it." Margaret Whitmore looked up at the loneliest rancher in Willow Creek Valley, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had promised to stand in front of her instead of behind, and it undid something in her chest she'd spent years tying shut. "All right," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "All right then." "All right," Ethan said. He tipped his hat to her, an old habit and instinct, the gesture a man makes to a woman he respects. He caught himself doing it, and didn't take it back. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Ethan." She went to her room off the kitchen and shut the door, and Ethan heard the lock turn, and he sat back down at the long table in the dark, and did not light a candle. He sat there a long while thinking about a wet April day in Missouri. He'd never seen a cottonwood tree, a grave, and the last thing a dying man had done with his remaining strength on this earth, which was to reach 400 miles across the plains and hand his only daughter to the one man he trusted not to break her. "I'll keep the word, Sam," Ethan said into the dark. "Whatever it costs me, I'll keep it." Outside, the wind came down off the high grass and moved through the valley, and somewhere out in the dark, Charles Whitaker's men were riding his fence lines the way they'd taken to doing lately, testing, watching, waiting for the lonely man to make one wrong move. But that was tomorrow's trouble, and the day after's, and all the days that were coming. Tonight there was only a quiet house with a lamp in it, and 2 broken people who'd shaken hands on a bargain and a promise made to the dead that neither of them yet understood would ask far more of them both than either was prepared to give. Thursday came gray and clear. Margaret was up before Ethan, which he'd learned was always to be the way of it, and when he came out to the kitchen, she had coffee on, and his records already spread across the long table in stacks he didn't recognize as his own. "You said tomorrow," he said. "I couldn't sleep. New house." She didn't look up. She had a pencil behind her ear and another in her hand, and 3 of his drawers emptied out in front of her. "Ethan, sit down a minute. We're to be at the church by 10. We've time. Sit down. There's something you need to see before we do." Something in her voice put him in the chair. She turned a sheet of paper around and slid it across to him. On it, in a neat hand he'd never had himself, she'd made 2 columns of figures. "Your cattle contract," she said. "With the Whitaker outfit. You sell them your beef at market." "That's right. Charles buys my stock every fall, ships it east on his rail contract. Only buyer close enough to matter." "How long has that arrangement stood?" 4 years, since the railroad came through his land and not mine. Margaret tapped the paper. 4 years ago he paid you $11 a head. This past fall he paid you $7. Prices fell. Everybody knows that. Beef's been down. "Beef's been down $2, Margaret said. "Not 4. I checked the Kansas City market reports at every station we passed through coming here because my father taught me to always know the price of the thing you're selling before you sit down with the man buying it." She looked up at him. "Charles Whitaker has been underpaying you $2 a head above and beyond the fall in the market for 4 years running. On the size of your herd, that's better than $3,000 he's quietly taken out of your pocket. And you never knew because you keep your books in your head, and a man's head is a poor place to keep the thing. A clever enemy is stealing from him." Ethan stared at the 2 columns of figures. $3,000. "That can't be right," he said. "It's right. I'll walk you through every line of it tonight if you want, and you'll see it's right. And then I expect you'll be angrier than you've been in some years." She gathered the paper back into its stack. "But not today. Today we get married, and we walk into that town, and you don't let one flicker of this cross your face. Because the man who's been robbing you is going to be sitting in that church, Ethan. Charles Whitaker will be there. Men like him always come to watch, and I want him looking at the 2 of us, thinking he's got a lonely fool and his charity bride." She stood and smoothed her gray dress, the best she had, still plain, still worn. "I want him underestimating us, both of us, all the way. Because that, my father used to say, is the one advantage they'll hand you for free. Let them think you're nothing. Then show them what nothing can do." Ethan looked at her a long moment. "Sam really did raise you right," he said. "He raised me to survive," Margaret said. "Now come on, put on your good shirt. We're getting married, and we're going to make this whole valley wonder what on God's earth you know that they don't." And Ethan Callahan, who had not smiled in front of another living soul in longer than he could rightly say, felt the corner of his mouth pull up, and this time he let it come. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He put on his good shirt. The church in Willow Creek was not a large building, but it held the whole town that Thursday morning, because there was not a soul in the valley who hadn't heard by Wednesday night that Ethan Callahan was getting married, and not a soul who intended to miss it. They came the way people come to a hanging, which is to say with their Sunday clothes on, and their eyes sharp, and their mouths already working before they'd taken their seats. The pews filled early. The women in their good bonnets sat straight and proper, with their hands folded and their faces arranged into expressions of Christian neutrality that didn't fool anyone for a second. The men stood along the walls with their hats in their hands and watched the door. Charles Whitaker sat in the front row on the left side, which was where the important men of Willow Creek sat. He was a large man, well-fed, with the kind of face that looked pleasant, until you noticed the eyes, which were the pale, flat blue of shallow water. He wore a good coat and held his hat on his knee, and smiled at everyone who looked at him, and he was the picture of a neighbor come to celebrate. He had no intention of celebrating. Reverend Hollis stood at the altar with his Bible and his long-suffering expression, the one he wore to funerals and difficult baptisms, and the weddings of people the congregation had opinions about. Then the door opened. Ethan came in first in his good shirt and his hat held at his side, his boots cleaned to a shine that cost him 40 minutes he didn't have to spare. He walked the way he always walked, like a man who owned the ground under his feet, and he looked straight ahead and did not acknowledge the murmuring that started up the moment he appeared. Margaret came in beside him. She wore the gray dress again because it was the best she had, and she wore it like it was silk. She'd done something with her hair that Ethan noticed without knowing what it was, pinned it up neat and clean, and she'd found somewhere a small blue ribbon that she'd worked into it, the one bit of color about her. Her chin was level. Her eyes moved once around the room, reading every face in it, the way she'd read his ledgers fast and thorough, missing nothing. The murmuring got louder. Ethan heard a woman in the third row say it just plainly enough to be heard, Lord, she's twice the size of him. He didn't look toward the voice. He kept moving. He felt Margaret's step beside him steady itself just barely, and then steady again, and she kept walking, and he matched her stride for stride. They stopped in front of Reverend Hollis, who looked at them with an expression that could have been sympathy or just nearsightedness. "You ready?" Ethan asked her quietly. "Been ready," she said, just as quiet. Charles Whitaker watched from the front row with his pleasant face and his shallow eyes, and when Ethan caught his gaze for half a second, Whitaker smiled wide and warm, the smile of a man watching something he expects to benefit from. Ethan looked away from him and looked at Margaret instead. Hollis began. The ceremony was short because Ethan had asked for short and paid accordingly. The words were the old ones, the plain ones, the ones that had been said over people in that valley for 40 years. Hollis said them without flourish, and without the sermon he normally attached to weddings because Ethan had paid him to skip it. When it came to the ring, there was a pause. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and produced a plain gold band that had belonged to his grandmother, the one piece of jewelry he owned, and Margaret looked at it a half-second too long before she held out her hand. "I should have mentioned this before," Ethan said low, so only she could hear. "It was my grandmother's. You don't have to wear it. I can get you something else." "I want to wear it," she said equally low. "Put it on." He put it on. Hollis pronounced them husband and wife, told Ethan he could kiss his bride as was customary. Ethan turned to Margaret. She was already looking at him with a calm expression that said whatever you decide is fine, and neither of us has to make this into something it isn't. He bent and kissed her cheek. Brief. Decent. The kind of kiss a man gives a woman he respects. In the front row, a woman pursed her lips. In the second row, another hid a smirk behind her handkerchief. And Charles Whitaker applauded. He started it, and then others followed because Whitaker had that kind of gravity in a room, and the sound of it rolled through the church like something hollow. Margaret stood very still in the middle of all of it, with Ethan's grandmother's ring on her finger, and a face that showed nothing at all, and Ethan thought she was the most disciplined person he had ever watched pretend not to be hurting. And he made a decision right then that surprised even him. He took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, not slow or announced. He just reached over and took her hand the way a man takes hold of something he intends to keep, and he stood there beside her while the hollow applause died down and he let every person in that room see it. The smirking woman stopped smirking. Charles Whitaker's applause slowed and stopped, and he watched Ethan with the pale flat eyes, and the pleasant smile didn't waver, but something behind it shifted. Margaret's fingers tightened around his just once. Then they walked out of that church the same way they'd walked in side by side, and the whole valley watched them go and had absolutely nothing useful to say about it. Afterward, standing outside in the dry summer air, Margaret let go of his hand, and neither of them mentioned it. "Whitaker was watching you the whole time," she said. "I know. He wasn't watching you the way a neighbor watches a friend get married." She kept her voice down, though there was no one close. "He was watching the way a man watches a problem he thought was simple turn complicated. Let him watch. I intend to." She looked up at him. "Ethan, the feed contracts. When do you sign the next round?" He stared at her. "We've been married 20 minutes. "I know when we've been married. The contracts." He almost laughed. He pressed his lips together to stop it. "End of August. That's 6 weeks. I'll have something better for you before then. There's a buyer out of Billings I read about in a newspaper at the station paying $2 over market on beef contracts to pull suppliers away from Whitaker's rail line. I want to write to him this week." She smoothed the front of her dress. "But first we need to get back to the ranch because I still have 3 months of your records to go through, and the feed bills alone are going to take me most of tomorrow." "Most women want a wedding supper," Ethan said. "I want Whitaker broke and your ranch profitable," Margaret said. "The supper can wait." He looked at her. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, trying it out. She tried it too quietly to herself. "Mrs. Callahan." Then she nodded like she'd decided it fit. "Let's go home." The first week was an education. Margaret rose before the sun every day. Not from virtue, she told him once, but because her mind started working the moment she was conscious, and it was easier to get up than to lie there losing the argument with herself. By the time Ethan came in from the early feeding, she had coffee made. His records sorted into stacks, she labeled in her neat hand, and a list of questions that made him feel simultaneously like he'd never understood his own ranch, and like he'd been waiting years for someone to ask exactly these questions. "Your feed supplier," she said on the third morning, sliding a page across the table. "Thomas Bauer. You've been paying him this price for 3 years. He's close, saves me the freight. He's charging you 40 cents a bushel above the next nearest supplier. On your volume, that's more than $200 a year." She set her pencil down. "Has he ever given you a reason to be loyal to him specifically?" Ethan thought about it. "He extends credit in a lean year. All right, that's worth something, but it's not worth $200 a year, and I think if you told him you'd had a better offer, he'd come down because losing your account would hurt him more than coming down would." She picked her pencil back up. "I'll draft you a letter this afternoon. You sign it. We'll see what he says." "You don't want to send it yourself." She paused. "I think it'll carry more weight with your name on it for now. Later, once people in this valley know what I can do, may be different. But right now they see a wife. They don't take orders from a wife. They take orders from Ethan Callahan." She said it flat. No bitterness in it, just the fact of it. "So we use that. We use everything we've got." Ethan sat across from her in the thin morning light with his coffee and watched her go back to the figures, and he thought about what it must have cost a woman with that mind to spend 29 years being told to set it aside. And something in him went angry on her behalf, quiet and steady, in a way it hadn't gone angry for anything in a long time. "Margaret," he said. You're going to sign those letters too. Both names." He picked up his cup. "It's your ranch, same as mine. Start as you mean to go on." She looked up from the page. Just for a second. Something crossed her face that she closed down fast, but not fast enough. "Both names," she said. "Both names." She looked back at the figures, and when she spoke again, her voice was the same as always, steady and precise. But she was holding the pencil a little differently. The town in the days that followed was exactly what they'd expected. Ethan heard the talk secondhand from his hand, Billy, a 20-year-old kid from Arkansas, who was constitutionally incapable of keeping information to himself, and constitutionally incapable of knowing when to stop. "They're saying she married you for the ranch," Billy reported one afternoon, not meeting Ethan's eye, not quite able to help himself. "The women at the Mercantile anyhow. Mrs. Archer said, well, she said you could have done better, Mr. Callahan, and that she reckons—" "Billy," Ethan said. "Sir?" "I don't want to know what Mrs. Archer reckons. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good." He went back to the fence post he was working. A pause. "She put anything on account at the Mercantile yet?" "Ma'am Callahan." "No, sir. She hasn't been to town since the wedding." "She will. You make sure Mrs. Archer and the rest know that whatever Mrs. Callahan puts on my account is put on my account, and I settle my accounts in full and on time, same as always." Another pause. "And Billy." "Sir." "She puts anything on account, you make sure she gets the same prices I get, not the ones they give women shopping alone." Billy was quiet a moment. Then, "Yes, sir. I'll pass the word." Margaret heard about this conversation from Billy herself, because Billy also couldn't keep that to himself, and she said nothing to Ethan about it that day. But that evening, when she set his supper plate in front of him, she put her hand on his shoulder for a half a second as she passed behind his chair, brief and light as a bird landing, and then she was already at the basin before he thought to react. They fell into a rhythm the way two practical people fall into things, without discussing it, just by doing it. Ethan handled the animals and the land and the hands. Margaret handled the accounts and the correspondence and the supply negotiations, and she moved through these tasks with a quiet ferocity that Ethan recognized from his own work, the focus of someone who'd been waiting a long time to be allowed to do what they were made for. 3 weeks into the marriage, Thomas Bauer, the feed supplier, wrote back. He came down 30 cents a bushel, which was not the 40 Margaret had aimed for, and she took the letter to Ethan in the evening and spread it out on the table. "It's not everything," she said, But it's $150 a year back in your pocket, which is $150 more than you had yesterday. She tapped the letter. Write back and say you'll consider it for another year and see if he can do better on bulk orders. Don't accept yet. Let him wonder. You've done this before, Ethan said, not a question. I've thought about doing this for 15 years, Margaret said. Watching men with less sense than me make worse deals and walk away pleased with themselves. Now I get to do it in practice. The ghost of a smile. Turns out practice is better. It was somewhere in the fourth week that Willow Creek stopped laughing and started paying attention. It happened first at the feed store where Margaret went alone on a Wednesday to pick up the terms on their next grain order. She came back with a contract and a look on her face that was satisfaction so compressed it barely showed. He tried to quote me the women's price, she told Ethan that evening. 15% above what he'd have quoted you. Ethan set his fork down. And I quoted him the Kansas City Standard and the Helena Tender and the cost of freighting direct from Billings to the dollar, and then I told him I was sure there'd been a mistake in his figures and perhaps he'd like to try again. She picked up her own fork. He tried again. We got the men's price and a 0.5% discount on spring orders for the inconvenience. Ethan stared at her. A 0.5% discount, he repeated. He was embarrassed. Embarrassed men overpay to make themselves feel better. I've observed this. She ate. The invoice is on the desk if you want to see it. He didn't look at the invoice. He looked at her at the plain, matter-of-fact way she described pulling a grown man inside out at his own counter. And he thought about Caroline, who had been laughter and warmth and everything gentle, whom he had loved completely, who could not have walked into that feed store and done what Margaret Callahan had just done, and he felt two things at once that he had no language for. He let both of them go without naming them. Good, he said. Yes, she agreed. It was. The letter to the Billings buyer went out the first week of August, signed by both of them, M. and E. Callahan. Callahan, Ranch Willow Creek. Ethan had half expected no reply, or a reply addressed only to him. The reply came back in 2 weeks, addressed to both of them, and opened with a direct response to each point Margaret had laid out in her letter, and the offered price per head was $3 above what Whitaker had been paying. Ethan read it twice at the table, then pushed it across to Margaret, who read it once, made a small sound in the back of her throat, and started calculating. We break the Whitaker contract at the end of August, she said. The penalty clause is 14 days' notice, which you can give now. By the time the fall drives come, we've got our own shipping arrangement through the Billings connection, and we don't need his rail line. She looked up. Ethan, you're going to make more money from this fall's cattle than you've made in the last 3 years combined. He should have felt triumph. He felt something closer to fury, the slow, deep kind. 3,000 he already took from me, he said. Yes. And now we pull the contract, he'll know something's changed. He'll want to know what. I expect he'll find out, Margaret said. And I expect that'll be a problem. She folded her hands on the table, and her voice stayed even, but her eyes didn't. I've been thinking about Whitaker, Ethan. Not just the contract. There's something larger happening here. The way he's approached your fence line. The land records I found where his men filed an easement claim on your east water source without your knowledge. The underpaid contracts weren't just greed. They were pressure. He's been trying to make this ranch too expensive to hold. She paused. He wants your land, specifically your water. The room went quiet. He filed an easement claim, Ethan said, 2 years ago. It's in the county records. I sent a letter to the county clerk in Helena last week, asking for certified copies of everything on file for your parcel. They came back yesterday morning. I've been going through them. She reached under the stack of papers on the table and produced a folded document. He claims prescriptive right to use the Eastern Creek, says his cattle have used it for 7 years, and therefore he has the legal standing. But his land doesn't border yours on the east. There's 40 yards of public grazing land between his fence and your property line, and that means his cattle were trespassing to reach the creek, which means the prescriptive claim doesn't hold under territorial law. She set the document down, but nobody challenged it when he filed it, Because nobody in this valley goes looking through county records on somebody else's property, and you didn't know it existed. Ethan had gone very still. He filed a legal claim on my water, he said. He did. 2 years ago. While he was sitting across from me at Fall Settlement and shaking my hand. While he was shaking your hand. Margaret's voice was quiet. He's been playing a longer game than you knew, Ethan. The contract, the easement, the fence pressure. He's building a case. He wants to make it look like your ranch is economically failing and legally entangled, and then he'll offer to buy you out at a price that's an insult and make it seem like a favor. She folded her hands again. That's what he came to watch at our wedding. He came to see if I was the kind of wife who'd help you, or the kind who'd be one more thing dragging the ranch down. Ethan pushed back his chair. He stood. He walked to the window that faced the eastern fence line, which was invisible in the dark, but which he could see in his head, clear as anything. Every post, every wire, the creek running silver underneath the cottonwoods beyond it. I've had enough of men helping themselves to what's mine, he said, and his voice was the one that cleared rooms. I know. Margaret waited until he turned back from the window. Don't go after him yet. We don't have everything. The easement challenge is solid, but the contract dispute needs a lawyer's letter to have teeth, and I want more on the land records before we make any move he can see coming. She looked at him straight. The best time to hit a man like Charles Whitaker is when he still thinks he's winning. Let him think that. A few more weeks. Then we take everything we have to the county judge, and we don't give him a single day to prepare a counter. Ethan held her gaze. A few more weeks, he said. A few more weeks. In the meantime, you give Whitaker his 14 days notice on the contract, and you do it polite, and you tell him you've had a family offer from relatives up in Billings that you'd be foolish to pass up. Let him think it's personal, not business. Let him think it's something you stumbled into. She set her pencil down. He'll be angry. Men like him are always angry when the pieces they've been moving rearrange themselves without his permission. But angry men make mistakes, and I'll be watching for them. Something settled in Ethan's chest then that had been unsettled for years. Not peace exactly. More like the feeling before a fight when you've got your feet right under you and your hands where they need to be. He went after the wrong rancher, Ethan said. He did, Margaret said. He just doesn't know it yet. It was Billy who brought the first warning that Whitaker knew something had changed. The boy came in from town on a Friday evening, moving faster than his usual amble, and he found Ethan and Margaret both in the kitchen, where they'd taken to doing the evening's accounts together, and he stood in the doorway turning his hat in his hands. Got something to tell you, Mr. Callahan. Ma'am. Say it, Ethan said. I was at the saloon, wasn't drinking, I was just there. And Whitaker's man Doyle was there, and he was talking loud enough to want people to hear him. He said... Billy stopped. Billy, Margaret said, say it plain, whatever it is. He said Mrs. Callahan's not what she appears to be. Said she came out here under false pretenses. Said her family back in Missouri have got a reputation, and she came west to hide from it. He was looking at the floor. Said you deserved better, Mr. Callahan. Said a man of your standing married beneath himself, and the whole county knows it. The kitchen went very quiet. Ethan had the particular stillness of a man deciding not to do the first thing that came to mind. Margaret sat without moving for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote something down, a single number in the margin of the feed invoice in front of her. Doyle said it, she said. Not Whitaker himself. No, ma'am. Whitaker was there, but it was Doyle who talked. So Whitaker wanted it said, but keeps his name off it. That's useful. She didn't look up from the page. What did the men listening do, Billy, when Doyle said it? Some of 'em laughed, Billy said miserably. Some, not all. Pete Harrow told Doyle to put a sock in it. Said whatever Mr. Callahan does is Callahan's business, and Doyle ought to find himself a shorter stick to poke with. 2 or 3 others seemed to agree. Pete Harrow, Margaret repeated. Good man, Ethan said. I've known his family 20 years. Then go see Pete Harrow tomorrow, Margaret said. Not about this, not directly. Just go see him, neighbor to neighbor. Find out how his ranch is doing. Find out if Whitaker's had any dealings with him, any contracts, any pressure. She set the pencil down and looked at Billy. And Billy, thank you for telling us. I know that wasn't easy to repeat. I wasn't gonna not tell you, Billy said, with a directness that surprised Ethan. It wasn't right what Doyle said. You've been decent to me, Mrs. Callahan. You told me where I was putting the numbers wrong in that inventory count and didn't make me feel stupid about it. He straightened up. I don't care what Doyle says. Neither do I, Margaret said. But I care what Doyle was told to say and why now. That tells me something important. She looked at Ethan. He knows about the contract. Somehow he knows we're moving the cattle contract or suspects it. The gossip is a warning. He's telling us to back down. He don't know me well, Ethan said. No, Margaret said. He doesn't know either of us. Billy went out, and they sat with the evening settling around the kitchen, and Margaret put her elbow on the table and her chin in her hand in a posture he'd come to recognize as her thinking position. He'll escalate, she said. Men like Whitaker, when the soft pressure doesn't work, they go harder. He'll find some other way to push. She paused. We need to move faster. Get the lawyer's letter out to the county clerk this week on the easement challenge. Get the Billings contract signed. She looked at her hands on the table. And Ethan, get your neighbors together. Not formally. Just have Pete Harrow over and whoever else you trust and let me talk to them. Because I'd wager this valley that Whitaker has done the same thing to 3 or 4 other ranchers that he's done to you, and if I'm right about that, then we're not fighting one ranch's battle. We're fighting the whole valley's. Ethan turned that over. You'd wager the valley, he said. The numbers, Ethan. She tapped the papers in front of her. I've been looking at every piece of public record I can lay my hands on. Land filings, water claims, contract records from the county office. The pattern isn't just you. It's deliberate, and it's systematic, and he's been at it at least 6 years. She looked at him steadily. He's not trying to buy a ranch. He's trying to buy a valley. The quiet that followed lasted a long time. Then Ethan said, I'll ride to Harrow's in the morning. Good. You'll come with me. She looked up. You sure a rancher calling on his neighbor with his wife to talk business? Pete Harrow is a straight-dealing man. He'll hear you. Ethan pushed back from the table. And Margaret, I want his wife there too, because if what you're saying is right, and I think it is, then every rancher in this valley is going to want their wife in the room when the plan gets made. Because the men'll argue, and the women'll get it done, and I've had enough of men arguing on this one. Margaret looked at him. There was something in her face that wasn't the careful, neutral expression she wore for town, for business, for the church women and their handkerchiefs. It was something younger than that. Something she hadn't shown anybody in a long time. All right, she said. All right. He stood. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Ethan. He was at the door to the hallway when she said it quietly without looking up from the papers. Ethan, when you told Billy to make sure I get the same price as you get at the Mercantile. A pause. That mattered. I want you to know that. He stood in the doorway. Didn't seem like something that needed saying, he said. Seemed like something that needed doing. Most people stop at the saying. She picked up her pencil. You stopped at the doing. That's different. He said nothing for a moment. Your daddy used to say something like that, he said finally, about the difference between talking and doing. I know. He said it to me often enough. There was a softness in her voice now that only came out at night when the day's work was done and the armor wasn't needed as much. He would have liked to see this, she said. This kitchen, the work we're doing. He'd have looked at these figures and shaken his head and probably said he told me so. He told you what? That the right man would let me be what I was. She was quiet. He just never lived to see if he was right. Ethan stood in the doorway of his kitchen, in his house that had been too empty for 6 years, and looked at the woman bent over his numbers at his table, wearing a plain dress with a blue ribbon in her hair, and a wedding ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and he felt the thing he'd been not naming for weeks push up against the inside of his chest like something that intended to get out eventually, whether he permitted it or not. He put his hat on. He was right, Ethan said, and he went to bed. Outside in the dark, a rider moved slowly along the eastern fence line. He stopped at the water gate, sat there a while, looking at the creek beyond the cottonwoods. Then he rode hard for the Whitaker main house with a message that wouldn't wait for morning. The ride to Harrow's place took 40 minutes on a good horse, and Ethan pushed the pace. Margaret sat beside him on the wagon bench, her satchel on her lap, and 3 months' worth of compiled records tucked inside it. She'd been up at 4 working. He'd heard her through the wall, the scratch of pencil on paper, the soft creak of the chair. He hadn't said anything about it because there was nothing to say. She worked the way he worked the land, like it was the only answer she had to everything, and he understood that. They didn't talk much on the ride, but it wasn't the silence of 2 people with nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people thinking about the same problem from different angles, which was its own kind of conversation. Pete Harrow came out to meet them in the yard when he heard the wagon wiping his hands on a cloth. A big weathered man, a few years older than Ethan, with an honest face and permanent squint lines from too many years facing the sun. "Callahan," he said. Then taking off his hat, "Mrs. Callahan, welcome." "Pete." Ethan stepped down and shook his hand. "Is Dorothy in?" "We've got something we need to talk through with both of you." Pete's squint deepened slightly. He wasn't a man who alarmed easy. "She's in. Come on." Dorothy Harrow was small and sharp-eyed, and had the kind of practical intelligence that never got credited because she kept it quiet in the presence of men she didn't trust. She looked at Margaret the way women look at other women, their assessing fast and complete, and then she put out her hand. "Mrs. Callahan, I've heard about you." "I expect you have," Margaret said. "I heard you got the feed price down at Griggs's," Dorothy said. 30 cents a bushel." A pause. "I've been trying to do that for 2 years." Margaret smiled, and it was the first fully genuine smile Ethan had seen from her that wasn't in the privacy of the kitchen. "That's actually part of why we came," she said. "Come sit down, Mrs. Harrow. I've got some numbers I think you're going to find very interesting." They sat at the Harrow kitchen table, all 4 of them, and Margaret opened her satchel and laid out what she had. She spread the documents and spoke plainly and didn't hedge or qualify, and she looked at Dorothy as much as at Pete, which Dorothy noticed. "This is the easement claim Whitaker filed on Ethan's Eastwater 2 years ago," she said, sliding the certified copy to Pete. "And this is the territorial code on prescriptive easement rights, which I wrote out in full because I wanted you to see it, not just my reading of it." She slid that across too. "And this is the contract Ethan had with Whitaker on the cattle, and these are the Kansas City market prices for the same period, and these are the numbers showing the gap." Pete Harrow looked at the documents for a long time. Dorothy looked at them over his shoulder. $3,000, Pete said. "At a minimum," Margaret said. "That's only on the cattle contract. I haven't finished calculating the feed overcharge." Silence. "Pete," Ethan said, "tell me straight. Has Whitaker had any dealings with you on pricing contracts? Anything like that in the last 5 years?" Pete Harrow looked at his wife. She looked back. "The South Water claim," Dorothy said quietly. "Tell them about the South Water claim." Pete put both hands on the table. "He filed an easement on my South Creek 3 years ago. I found out because my brother-in-law works at the county office. I challenged it, and Whitaker's lawyer sent me a letter saying I was mistaken about my property lines, and they'd be willing to survey at my expense." He set his jaw. "I didn't have the money for a survey, so I left it." "He does this to everyone," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "He's done it to at least 3 ranches I know of in this valley," Dorothy said. "Mine, the Ketterings, and old Frank Moss, who sold out last year. Frank always said he sold because he was tired, but Frank wasn't tired. Frank was broke, and he was broke because Whitaker had been bleeding him the same as he'd been bleeding you, and Frank didn't have a way to fight back." Margaret had 5 days to prepare for Saturday, and she used every hour of them. She wrote letters. She sent Billy to the county office in town 3 separate times. She drafted a 12-page summary of what she'd found across every property record she could access, cross-referenced with the market data she'd been collecting since before she ever stepped off that wagon. By Friday evening, the kitchen table had disappeared entirely under papers, and she was still at it at midnight when Ethan came out for water and found her there, pencil behind one ear and another in her fist. "Go to bed," he said. "In a while." "Margaret." "Ethan." She didn't look up. "If Pete Harrow walks in here tomorrow, and I am not completely ready, we lose him. Neighbors don't commit to a fight unless they believe the fight can be won. I need to show them it can be won. That takes preparation." She turned a page. "Go to bed. I'll be fine." He stood there a moment. Then he put a fresh cup of coffee at her elbow and went back to his room without another word. She was still there when the sun came up. The neighbors arrived on Saturday in ones and twos over the course of the morning. Pete and Dorothy Harrow came first. Pete with his hat in his hands, and Dorothy with a covered dish she set on the sideboard without being asked. The Ketterings came next. Amos Kettering, who was 50, and had the slow, careful manner of a man who'd been deceived before, and wasn't eager to repeat the experience, and his wife Ruth, who said nothing for the first hour, and then turned out to be the sharpest person in the room. 2 more ranchers came after that men. Ethan knew well. Men who'd worked this valley their whole lives and knew every fence line and water claim in it. They sat around the long table and they looked at Margaret, and Ethan watched them do it, watched the quick assessment. Each of them made the inventory of who she was and whether she was worth their Saturday morning, and he felt something in him go taut and ready. Margaret stood at the head of the table with her papers, and she didn't apologize for being there, and she didn't explain herself. She just said, "Thank you for coming. I'm going to show you something about Charles Whitaker, and I need you to look at it with open eyes, because what I've found is going to make you angry, and angry people don't always see clearly. So stay with me." Amos Kettering leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Callahan, I don't know you." "No," Margaret said, "but you know what's in these papers because some of it happened to you." She slid a document across to him. "That's the easement Whitaker filed on your north pasture water access 4 years ago. Did you know about it?" Kettering looked at the paper, his jaw set. "I knew about it," he said. "Whitaker told me it was a county surveying error and it would be cleared up. It was never cleared up. It's still on the record today, and it's not a surveying error. It's a claim filed by his lawyer that if he ever chose to enforce it would allow him to route his cattle through your north pasture to the water, which would effectively make your north pasture unusable for your own herd during drive season." She let that sit. "Did he tell you that part?" Kettering said nothing. Ruth Kettering said from the end of the table, "He did not." That was the first 10 minutes. By the end of the first hour, Margaret had laid out the full picture ranch by ranch, claim by claim, with the figures and the dates and the certified copies from the county office to back every word. The room had gone from cautious to quiet, to the particular quality of silence that happens when people are understanding something they wish they didn't have to understand. Pete Harrow was the one who said it out loud. "He's been planning to own this valley for years." "Yes," Margaret said. "He set it up so we'd each think we had a small problem," Pete said. "A clerical error here, a price adjustment there. Nothing big enough to fight individually." "That's exactly right. Because individually none of you could afford to fight it. The legal costs alone would have broken most of these ranches." Margaret put her hands flat on the table. "But together the picture changes. Together you have enough documentation to bring a fraud claim before the territorial court. Together the legal costs divide into something manageable. And together you have something Whitaker doesn't have, which is the truth fully documented, and 5 ranchers willing to stand behind it." Dorothy Harrow was the first one to say it. "What do you need from us? Every document you have. Contracts, letters, anything in writing from Whitaker or his men over the past 7 years. Your own records from the same period, so we can show the pattern of below-market pricing." She looked around the table. "And I need your word that when this goes before the judge, you'll stand there and say what happened to you. In your own words. Because a court can look at paper all day, but what changes things is a rancher standing up in front of a judge and saying, 'This man cheated me, and here is how he did it, and here is what it cost me.' Amos Kettering had been studying the documents for the last 20 minutes. He was the kind of man who didn't speak until he'd thought it through, and when he looked up, everyone at the table knew he'd thought it through. "My wife and I have been in this valley for 18 years, he said. "Built our ranch from nothing. Our son's supposed to take it over when I'm done." He paused. "If Whitaker gets what he's after, there won't be a ranch for my son to take." He put his hand on the stack of papers in front of him. "What do I sign?" The room shifted like a tide turning. 2 hours later, the neighbors were gone, and the table was covered in new documents. Everything they'd brought with them. The accumulated evidence of years of quiet theft. Margaret sat in the middle of it, and she was more tired than Ethan had ever seen her. The kind of tired that goes all the way down. But she was also the most alive. He'd seen her, her eyes bright and her hands still moving through the papers. "We've got enough," she said. "We've got more than enough. What we need now is a lawyer in Helena who isn't in Whitaker's pocket, and I've been making inquiries." She looked up at Ethan. "There's a man named Aldrich. Solomon Aldrich. He has a reputation for taking on land fraud cases in the territory. I wrote to him 2 weeks ago." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat. "You wrote to a Helena lawyer 2 weeks ago. I wrote to 3. Aldrich is the one whose reputation holds up on examination." She produced a letter from under the pile. "He wrote back. He's willing to review the case. He'll be in Billings next month for another matter, and he can meet us there." Ethan read the letter. "This is going to cost money," he said. "The 5 ranches together can cover his fee. I've already calculated each family's share based on what I know of their holdings. It's less than any of them think." She took the letter back. "And Ethan, if we win, and I believe we will win, the court can order Whitaker to pay costs and damages, which means every family in that room today stands to recover a good portion of what they've lost." He looked at her across the table, across the mountain of evidence she'd built out of public records and feed invoices and cattle contracts. This woman who'd arrived at his gate 8 weeks ago with a suitcase and her father's last letter, and he thought, "Samuel Whitmore, you knew exactly what you were doing." "All right," he said. "We go to Billings." What Ethan didn't know, and Margaret didn't know, was that one of the 5 men who'd sat at that table on Saturday had a son who worked at the Whitaker Ranch. The son didn't mean any harm by it, probably. He mentioned to a fellow hand over supper Sunday night that his father had been to a meeting at the Callahan place. The hand mentioned it to Doyle. Doyle was in Whitaker's study by Monday morning. Ethan found out about it the way he found out about most things since Margaret arrived, through Billy, who had ears everywhere and a conscience that wouldn't let him keep what he heard. "Doyle knows there was a meeting," Billy said, coming in from town on Monday afternoon. "I don't know how much else Whitaker knows, but Doyle was asking around about which ranchers had visited your place over the weekend." Ethan took that to Margaret. She set down her pencil, picked it back up, set it down again. "How soon can you get a letter to Aldrich and Helena?" "Billy can write it to the telegraph office today." "Do it. We need to move the Billings meeting up." She stood. "And we need to move it up without anyone knowing we've moved it up, which means we tell no one outside this house, not even Pete Harrow until the night before, because I don't know yet which end of that table the information came from, and I don't want to find out the hard way." Ethan felt the cold of that. "You think one of them told Whitaker?" "I think one of them has a son who works for Whitaker, which is not the same as betrayal, but has the same practical effect." She moved to her writing desk. "I'm not angry about it. It's information. I'm filing it." "You're filing it," Ethan said flatly. "People talk. Especially people who are scared. And everyone at that table is scared, Ethan, even the ones who hid it well. Whitaker has had years to make himself frightening in this valley. That doesn't undo overnight." She was already writing. "What matters now is that we get to Aldrich before Whitaker gets to us. Get that telegraph out today." The telegraph went out that afternoon. Aldrich's reply came back in 2 days. He could be in Billings by the following Friday. They would need to bring everything they had. On Wednesday evening, 3 days before they were to leave for Billings, Ethan was in the barn doing the last check on the horses when he smelled the smoke. He came out of the barn fast. The cattle barn on the east side was lit up like a lantern orange against the dark sky, the flames already into the roof by the time he saw them. He shouted, Billy came out of the bunkhouse at a run. Two other hands were on their feet and moving before Ethan had finished calling. They worked the water pump and the bucket line, and they saved the outer walls, and they saved the horses, but the roof came down, and it took a good portion of the east side with it, and when the sun came up in the morning, there was nothing left of a third of the barn but char and twisted timber. Margaret stood at the edge of it in the early light, very still, the same way she'd stood at the gate that first day, with his rifle pointed at her, just taking it in. Ethan stood beside her. "Accident," Billy said, because Billy still needed to believe people weren't that bad. "Dry summer. Could have been anything." "Could have," Ethan said. Margaret didn't say anything for a while. Then, "Billy, I need you to do something for me, and I need you not to ask me why yet." "Yes, ma'am. I need you to go around the south side of the barn away from where everyone's been walking this morning, and I need you to look at the ground without touching anything. Don't go past the first fence post. Just look." Billy looked at her. Then he went. He was back in 4 minutes. "There's boot tracks," he said. "Not ours. Too big to be mine wrong sole pattern for either of the other hands." His voice had changed. "And there's something else. East corner where the wall burnt worst. Smells different than the rest of it." "Oil," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Ethan turned to her. She was already walking toward the east corner, careful about where she put her feet, her eyes on the ground. "Margaret," Ethan said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, something that recognized what she was doing and where it was going. "Margaret, stop. Let me. I'm not made of glass," she said, not sharply, just plainly without breaking stride. "And if you go tramping over it before I've had a good look, we'll lose what's left." She crouched down at the corner. She looked. She did not touch. "The fire started here. You can tell by the burn pattern on what's left of the wall. Everything burns from the source out." She stood. Someone poured something here and lit it and walked out the south side where the grass was dry enough not to hold footprints, except they cut the corner at the fence post and the earth was damp there from the water trough overflow. She turned back to him. "We have their boot size, and we have their direction of travel, and we have a smell that any judge in the territory will recognize as consistent with accelerant." She looked at him straight. "This is the escalation I told you was coming. He's frightened. We pushed the contract and he felt it, and now he's trying to frighten us into backing down." Ethan looked at the ruin of his barn. 11 years he'd worked this land. 11 years of post-hole digging and cattle driving and lean winters and everything. A man pours into a piece of ground he means to leave better than he found it, and some paid hand had walked up in the night and set a fire to it like it was nothing. He didn't speak for a moment. "Don't," Margaret said. He looked at her. "Don't go to Whitaker," she said. "I know what you're thinking, and I understand it, and I need you not to do it. Not today. Not before Billings." She crossed the distance between them, and she put her hand on his arm, and it was the most direct thing she'd touched since the day they'd shaken hands on the porch, and she held on. "If you go to him today, it'll look like what he wants it to look like. A desperate rancher throwing accusations after a barn fire, no proof, just anger. He's waiting for that, Ethan. He wants you furious and sloppy because furious and sloppy men don't win cases in territorial court." Her grip tightened. "Let me be angry for you. Let me put the anger into what we're taking to Aldrich. That's how we hurt him. Not with your fists. With the truth in front of a judge where he can't buy the outcome." He looked down at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face, at the clarity in it, the absolute controlled fury that she'd turned into something useful instead of something destructive. And he thought about Samuel Whitmore sitting up 9 nights with a man he barely knew because it was the right thing to do, and he thought that this was where that came from, this particular kind of stubborn, righteous patience, the willingness to do the hard thing instead of the satisfying one. "She is smarter than me. She is braver than me." The words from the letter came back to him, and he hadn't fully believed them when he'd first heard them because he hadn't yet had enough time to see what they meant. He believed them now. "All right," he said. She let go of his arm. "Good." She turned back toward the house. I'm going to write down everything we can document about this fire right now while it's fresh, and I'm going to attach it to the case file for Aldrich. What happened here is not separate from what Whitaker's been doing to this valley. It's the final proof of it. It's what a man does when the quiet methods stop working. She paused. He just handed us the case, Ethan. He's desperate enough to be stupid, and stupid is exactly what we needed him to be. Billy was behind them, still holding his hat in his hands, with the look of a young man whose understanding of the world has just been permanently rearranged. "What do I tell the other hands?" he asked. "About the fire. Tell them what it was." Margaret said, not turning around. "An accident. Dry summer. Could have been anything." She glanced back at Ethan, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't soft and wasn't hard. It was just resolved. Let Whitaker think it worked. Let him think we're scared. Frightened people don't travel to Billings to meet with lawyers. Let him spend the week thinking he's won. They left for Billings on Thursday night, a day early, without telling anyone but Pete Harrow, who was bringing his own documents and coming separately with Dorothy the following morning. Solomon Aldrich was not what either of them expected. They'd expected a city lawyer, polished and formal, the kind of man who made you feel the distance between his world and yours every time he opened his mouth. What they got was a man of 60 who looked like he'd spent more years outdoors than in, with a weathered face and reading spectacles and the habit of rolling his sleeves to the elbow when he worked, which he did at the hotel table where they met him the morning after arriving in Billings. He looked at the case file Margaret laid out for him, and he did not speak for a very long time. Pete and Dorothy Harrow were there, and Amos and Ruth Kettering, who'd made the ride themselves when Pete's letter reached them Thursday night. 6 people around a table in a Billings hotel room, and Margaret at the head of it again. "Walk me through the easement claims first," Aldrich said without looking up from the documents. Margaret walked him through them. He asked 2 questions. She answered both. He asked a follow-up that was sharper than the first 2, and she answered that too, and when she was done, he set his spectacles on the table and looked at her. "Where did you learn to read land records?" he said. "I taught myself," Margaret said. "I had good source material and a reason to understand it." You cross-referenced the prescriptive easement statute with the territorial code on trespass. If his cattle were trespassing to reach the water, the prescriptive claim fails. That seemed important. "It's the center of the whole challenge," Aldrich said. He picked up one of the certified copies. "And the barn fire, the boot tracks, documented how I made a sketch with measurements the morning after. 2 of our hands witnessed both the sketch and the measurements. I have their signed statements in the back of the file." Margaret found the page and slid it across. "The accelerant smell is documented in Billy's statement as well as my own. I noted that I'm not a fire expert, but the logic of the burn pattern is straightforward, and I noted that too." Aldrich turned to the window, was quiet for long enough that Dorothy Harrow leaned toward Pete, and Pete shook his head slightly. "Wait, Mrs. Callahan," Aldrich said, finally turning back. "What you've built here is not a simple complaint. What you've built is a systematic fraud case with corroborating documentation on 5 separate properties supported by public records market data. 2 independent witnesses to physical evidence of arson and a timeline that establishes a deliberate pattern over 6 years. He set his hands on the table. "I have tried 14 land fraud cases in this territory. This is the best prepared case I have ever walked into as counsel." Margaret held his gaze. She did not say anything. "I'll take it," Aldrich said. Ruth Kettering, who hadn't spoken once in the meeting, said quietly, "We won't lose." Aldrich almost smiled. "No," he agreed. "I don't think we will either." When it was done, Ethan and Margaret walked out of the hotel into the Billings afternoon, and Dorothy Harrow hugged Margaret with a sudden fierceness that startled her. "First time in 3 years I felt like I could breathe," Dorothy said, still holding on. Margaret held her back. She thought of her father. She thought of how he used to say that doing what's right takes longer than doing what's easy, but it doesn't feel worse. It feels better, even when it hurts. She thought he was correct about that. On the road home the next morning, Margaret slept. She went out within the first 20 minutes, head tipped back, satchel across her lap, and she slept the way people sleep when they have not truly rested in weeks, and their body finally decides to take what it needs regardless of permission. Ethan drove and let her sleep. He thought about the deed. He thought about her name on it next to his. He thought about the lock on the room off the kitchen, and the fact that she hadn't locked it in 3 weeks. And he understood what it meant, and he understood why he hadn't said anything about it. Because there are things that can survive being left unspoken, and things that cannot, and he was smart enough finally to know the difference. She slept for 2 hours. When they came back into Willow Creek Valley in the late afternoon, the valley looked the same as it always had, wide grass and blue sky, and the mountains beyond it, and Ethan looked at it the way he always had, like something he intended to keep. The ranch came into view, and standing at the gate, his horse tied to the post, his hat in his hand, and his face arranged into the expression of a man who considers himself in full control of the situation, was Charles Whitaker. Margaret saw him the same moment Ethan did. "He knows," she said. "He knows." Ethan agreed. Then it started. She sat very straight on the bench. "Pull up slow. Let him speak first. Whatever he says, don't answer until I do." "Margaret." "Please, Ethan." She looked at him. "Let me." He pulled up slow. He let her. And Charles Whitaker smiled his pleasant smile at the man he'd been quietly ruining for 4 years. And then he looked at the woman beside him, the heavy plain woman from Missouri that everyone in this valley had underestimated since the day she arrived. And his smile held, but only just. "Callahan," Whitaker said. "Glad I caught you. We need to talk." Margaret Callahan looked down at him from the wagon bench, with 6 years of documented fraud in the satchel on her lap, and she said in a voice as calm and level as still water, "We certainly do, Mr. Whitaker. Step into the yard. This is going to take a while." Whitaker stepped into the yard like a man who owned it. That was his habit, Ethan understood now. Every space Whitaker entered, he moved through it as though the paperwork transferring it to his name was already filed and he was simply waiting on the ink to dry. He did it at the church, at the feed store, at every piece of ground in this valley he'd spent 6 years maneuvering to acquire. The walk itself was a negotiating tactic, and Ethan had never recognized it as such until the woman beside him had taught him to read what men like Whitaker did when they thought nobody was looking. Margaret came down from the wagon bench without assistance, and she did not step aside. She stood square in front of Whitaker, and she looked at him the way she looked at a column of figures that didn't add up, with complete attention and no particular emotion. Whitaker's smile didn't waver, but his eyes moved to her and stayed there a half-second longer than a comfortable man's eyes would. "Mr. Callahan," Whitaker said, addressing Ethan, "I think we both know this situation has gotten away from us a little. I'd like to discuss it between us, neighbor to neighbor, and get it back on good footing. I'm sure Mrs. Callahan has other things she'd prefer to—" "Mrs. Callahan stays," Ethan said. A pause. Brief, but there. "Of course. Whatever makes you comfortable." Whitaker spread his hands. "I'll be straight with you, Ethan. I've heard some talk about legal proceedings, claims about contracts and land records. I don't know where these ideas came from, but I think before either of us does something we can't undo, it's worth sitting down and talking like men who've been neighbors for years." "We have been neighbors for years," Ethan said, "during which time you filed a fraudulent easement claim on my eastern water without telling me it existed." Whitaker's face didn't change. That was the thing about him. He'd had years of practice keeping that pleasant face exactly where it was, regardless of what was happening underneath it. "That was a county surveying matter. A clerical—" "Mr. Whitaker," Margaret said. Both men looked at her. "I have the certified records from the Helena County office. Filed copies dated and stamped. I have the territorial code on prescriptive easement rights. I have the property maps showing the 40 yards of public land between your eastern fence and Mr. Callahan's property line, which means your cattle were trespassing to reach that water, which means the prescriptive claim fails under territorial law." She said it the way she said everything, level factual without heat. "I also have 4 years of cattle contract records showing you paid Mr. Callahan $2 per head below market rate, above and beyond the legitimate market decline, which over the volume of his herd constitutes fraud in excess of $3,000. And I have a signed statement from 2 witnesses and physical evidence documentation from the fire that destroyed a portion of this ranch's east barn 3 days ago. She paused. So when you say clerical error, Mr. Whitaker, I'd like to know specifically which document you're referring to, because I have certified copies of all of them, and I've read every one. The yard went very quiet. Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant face held. The eyes behind it were doing something different. "Little lady," he said, and his voice had shifted into something softer and more dangerous. "I can see you've been working very hard on your husband's behalf. That's admirable. But what you've put together there is a lot of paperwork that I'm sure looks very concerning to someone who doesn't have experience with how land and contracts actually work in this territory. My lawyers in Helena are very familiar with the relevant statutes, and I can assure you, your lawyers in Helena," Margaret said, "will be responding to a filing from Solomon Aldrich of the Aldrich firm, who has agreed to represent the 5 ranching families in this valley, whose properties and contracts you have systematically defrauded over the past 6 years. She let that land. Mr. Aldrich is filing the complaint in Helena on Monday. You have until then to decide whether you'd like to address this through the courts or through a negotiated settlement that returns what you've taken to the families you've taken it from. Either way is acceptable to us. The courts will take longer and cost you considerably more, but that decision is yours." Whitaker turned to Ethan, and this was the moment Ethan understood Margaret had been preparing him for since the night on the wagon when she'd said, "Don't answer until I do." Because what Whitaker was doing now was the thing she'd warned him about. The man-to-man turn. The look that said, "Pull your wife back. Let us handle this. Be the kind of man who runs his own affairs." Ethan tipped his hat. "You heard my wife," he said. Whitaker's pleasant face cracked. Not badly, not in a way most people would see. But Ethan had spent 11 years reading weather and animals and the small signals that told you what was coming before it arrived, and he saw it. The jaw tightened. The eyes went flat. The hands, which had been loose and open, closed just slightly at the sides. "Ethan," Whitaker said, and the neighbor-to-neighbor warmth was gone from his voice. "You have a burned barn. You have a wife you've known for 2 months who's been filling your head with stories she found in record books. You have a pile of paper that a good lawyer will pick apart in an afternoon, and you have no idea what you're walking into." He stepped closer, and now he was speaking the way a man speaks when he's decided the civilities are over. "I've been in this valley for 20 years. I have relationships with every judge in this territory, every land office, every man who matters in Helena. You want to make me an enemy over a water easement and a cattle contract. Over 6 years of fraud against 5 families, Ethan said. "Yeah, I do." Whitaker looked at him a long moment. Then he looked at Margaret. "You're very clever," he said to her, and the pleasantness was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was uglier than Ethan had imagined. "You came here with nothing, and you've convinced this man to bet his ranch on your paperwork. When this goes wrong, and it will go wrong because men like me do not lose to women like you in territorial courts, he'll lose everything, and you'll go back to wherever you came from, and he'll have nothing." He turned back to Ethan. "Think hard about what you're really risking here. Not just land. Everything you've built." He put on his hat. He walked to his horse. He mounted without hurry the way a man mounts who has all the time in the world and wants you to know it. Then he rode out. The dust from his horse was still in the air when Margaret turned to Ethan and said, "He's going to try to get to the county judge before Monday." "I know. We need to telegraph Aldrich tonight. Tell him to move the filing to Saturday if he can." She was already moving toward the house. "And we need to warn Pete Harrow. Whitaker's going to come at the weakest point in our group before Monday, find whichever of those ranchers is most frightened, and make them an offer that sounds like the better choice." "The man whose son works for Whitaker," Ethan said. "Frank Delacroix?" "Yes." She stopped at the door. "Ethan, he's rattled. That was real at the end. Not the part about his lawyers and his judges that was performance. The part about men like him and women like me that was the truth of what he thinks. And frightened people who believe they're better than you make mistakes. She looked at him. We just have to be standing there when he makes his. The telegraph went to Aldrich that night. Aldrich's reply came back within the hour. He would file Saturday morning. What happened next, no one in Willow Creek Valley predicted. Friday morning, Frank Delacroix came to the Callahan Ranch. He came alone without his wife, which told Ethan something before the man even opened his mouth. He stood in the yard turning his hat in his hands, and he had the look of a man who'd made a decision in the dark and was still not sure it was the right one. "Whitaker came to me last night," he said. Ethan waited. "Offered to settle my easement claim privately, drop it entirely, pay me back half of what I lost on the cattle contracts, no court involvement." Frank looked at his hat. He made it sound generous. "Told me the court case was risky, that his lawyers would drag it out for years, that I'd spend more in legal fees than I'd ever recover." He was quiet a moment. "He also made it clear that if I stayed in the case, things were going to get difficult on my south pasture. Didn't say how, just that they would." "He threatened you," Ethan said. "He was very polite about it," Frank said bitterly. Margaret came out of the house. She'd heard the wagon. She stood on the porch and looked at Frank Delacroix, and something in her face shifted into a very careful stillness. "Mr. Delacroix," she said, "did you take his offer?" "No," Frank said. "I came here instead." Margaret came down the porch steps. "Does your wife know you're here?" "She told me to come." He looked up. "She said Frank Margaret Callahan has done in 2 months what you haven't been able to do in 3 years, which is find a way to fight back. And if you take Whitaker's money and walk away, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you left your neighbors to it alone." "She wasn't wrong." "She isn't," Margaret said. She turned to Ethan. "He tried to buy Frank off because he needs to break the coalition. One ranch dropping the case weakens the whole pattern we're presenting." She looked back at Frank. "You held. Thank you for that." Frank nodded once short. "What do we do now?" "Now," Margaret said, "we do nothing. Aldrich files Saturday morning. By Monday, Whitaker won't be making any more offers because he'll be the one responding to court filings instead of the other way around." Saturday came. Billy rode to the telegraph office at 9 in the morning and came back at 11 with a single line on a paper that he handed to Margaret without a word. She read it. Then she set it face down on the table. "He filed," she said. Ethan looked at her. "It's done," she said. "It's in the court record. Whitaker can't make it go away now." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan sat at the long table where Samuel Whitmore's daughter had first spread his ledgers and shown him what was being stolen, and he thought about the East barn still half-charred the deed with 2 names on it, the fight it had taken to get here. "Your father would have liked this," he said. "He would have poured a whiskey," Margaret said. "Just the one, and raised it to the room." She looked at him. "You got any whiskey?" He got the whiskey. They raised their glasses and drank, and it was the most ceremony either of them had managed, and it was enough. What happened in the weeks that followed shook Willow Creek harder than anything since the dry summer of 1879. Whitaker's lawyers in Helena were very good, but Aldrich was better. The complaint laid out the 6-year fraud case in full, all 5 ranches, all documented, all cross-referenced and certified. And the territorial court judge assigned to the case was a man named Beaumont, who had a personal history with land fraud from his own family's experience in Kansas, and no patience for the kind of quiet, systematic theft that Whitaker had been running. Whitaker's lawyers fought back systematically. They challenged the documentation. Aldrich responded with certified copies and a 40-page rebuttal that Margaret had spent 10 days writing. They challenged the collective standing of the 5 ranchers. Aldrich answered with 3 territorial code precedents Margaret had found in a law reference borrowed from the county clerk and read in a single weekend. Then Whitaker offered a settlement. It came through his lawyers considerably less generous than what he had offered Frank Delacroix privately, which told everyone at the table exactly how seriously he was taking the case now. Aldrich brought the offer to the Callahan kitchen on a Thursday evening, all 5 families at the long table. Amos Kettering read it twice. "It's not enough." "No," Aldrich said. "It's not." Margaret looked at Frank Delacroix. "You were the one he came to first. You held when you could have taken the easy way. What do you want? Frank was quiet a moment. Then, I want to stand in front of that judge. I want it said out loud what he did. Not in a private letter with a confidentiality clause. Out loud. My son quit the Whitaker Ranch last week because I made him. I want the public record that proves I was right. The table made its decision without another word needing to be said. They refused the settlement. In the weeks before the trial, Whitaker tried to undo what they had built. He sent a man to pressure the county clerk's assistant into recanting his testimony. The assistant came straight to Aldrich instead and added witness tampering to the record. Whitaker filed a counter-complaint against Ethan for defamation. Aldrich had it dismissed in 4 days. And Whitaker's foreman, Doyle, rode onto the Callahan Ranch in the 3rd week of September to deliver a loud warning that Ethan was going to regret what his wife had started. Ethan walked up to Doyle until he was close enough to speak quietly, which meant Doyle had to choose between holding his ground and looking down at a man who was not scared of him, or backing up and looking like he was scared of Ethan. Doyle held his ground, which Ethan had expected. "Tell your boss," Ethan said, "that his foreman just gave us one more item for the court record. Billy." He raised his voice without taking his eyes off Doyle. "Write down what time it is and what Mr. Doyle said, and get your signature and the other hand's signatures on it before supper." "Yes, sir," Billy said. Doyle rode off. When Ethan came inside, Margaret was at her desk, and she'd heard all of it through the open window. "You handled that well," she said. "I had a good teacher." He sat down. "He's getting scared. He's been scared since the filing. This is what scared men do. They make noise to convince themselves they still have control." She set down her pencil. "Ethan, I want to tell you something." He looked at her. "When I got on that wagon in Missouri, I was terrified," she said. "I didn't show it because there wasn't anyone left to show it to, and there wasn't anything showing it would fix. But I was. My father had just died, and the farm was gone, and I was 400 miles from a man I'd never met riding toward a rifle that might or might not be pointed at my face." A pause. "I told myself it didn't matter what you were like. It mattered that there was a place. That was all I let myself want." Ethan didn't speak. "I stopped letting myself want things a long time ago," she said. "Wanting things and not getting them after a while. You learn to just stop. It's easier." She looked at her hands. "But somewhere between the ledgers and the lawyers and Billy making coffee at midnight and you putting my name on the letters, I started wanting again, not just the ranch." She looked up at him. "I want to tell you that. Before the court. Before all of this is settled and we know how it comes out. I want you to know it now while it's still uncertain." The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan sat with her words in the space between them, in the place where two people who've stopped believing in things find themselves unexpectedly believing again. And he thought about the lock on the door she'd stopped using, and the hand on his arm at the barn fire, and the way she'd laughed that once in Billings, like she'd forgotten she could. He thought about Caroline, and the stone his heart had gone to when she died, and the way that stone had been slowly, without his permission, becoming something else. "Margaret," he said, "you don't have to. I know I don't have to." He leaned forward. "I built a fence around myself when Caroline died and kept every living thing outside it for 6 years because inside was the only way I knew how to be safe. And then your daddy sent you to my gate and you stood there with a rifle in your face and didn't blink, and every week since, there's been one less board in that fence." He looked at her straight. "I don't have pretty words. But I've been watching you fight for this ranch like it's already yours, and I realized last week that I don't know when it stopped being because of a deal and started being because of something else. I think it was before Billings. Maybe before the neighbors' meeting. Maybe the night you told Billy to write down what he heard, and I stood there thinking, God, she thought of that before I did, and I was grateful, not embarrassed." He sat back. "I don't know exactly what this is yet, but I know it's real. And I know I don't want it to be uncertain a single day longer than it has to be." "Masani." Margaret held his gaze for a long moment. "That's the most words you've said at once since I got here," she said. "Don't get used to it." She smiled. The real one, the Billings one, the one that went all the way up to her eyes. "All right," she said. "Then let's win this case, and then figure out the rest." "Yes, ma'am," he said. Outside, September moved toward October, and the valley waited, and in a courtroom in Helena, a judge named Beaumont was reading a 40-page legal brief written by a woman from Missouri who had taught herself land law by lamplight because she needed a weapon, and that was the one she had. It was, as it turned out, exactly the right one. The trial lasted 2 days. Ethan had expected something with more ceremony. What he got was a wood-paneled room, 12 men in the jury box. Aldrich at the plaintiff's table, with his rolled sleeves, and Whitaker's team of 3 lawyers across the aisle, with their matching certainty that men like them did not lose in rooms like this. Margaret sat between Dorothy Harrow and Ruth Kettering in the front row, the 3 women like a wall, and Ethan thought this was exactly what Whitaker had failed to account for. Aldrich opened by putting the timeline on the record, 6 years, laid out in sequence, clean and factual and relentless. He called 3 of the ranchers to testify in turn. Then he called Margaret. Whitaker's lead lawyer, a man named Pressler, who had a reputation for making witnesses feel foolish on the stand, objected before Aldrich finished saying her name. "Your Honor, Mrs. Callahan is not a named complainant in this action. Her husband is. Her testimony is irrelevant unless—" "Mrs. Callahan compiled the documentary evidence on which this entire complaint rests," Aldrich said without raising his voice. "She is the most qualified witness to speak to what the documents contain and how they were obtained." Judge Beaumont looked at Pressler over his spectacles. "Overruled," he said. "Mrs. Callahan, please take the stand." Margaret walked to the stand the same way she'd walked into Ethan's church in Willow Creek on their wedding day, straight, unhurried, without a single glance at Pressler or at Whitaker, who was watching her from the defendant's table with an expression that had stopped being pleasant some time ago. Aldrich asked her about the easement records first. She explained them clearly, explained the territorial code, explained why the prescriptive claim failed, and she explained it in terms simple enough that the 12 men in the jury box were nodding along, which Pressler noticed and did not like. Then it was Pressler's turn. He came at her from 3 directions in the first 10 minutes, each designed to make her seem out of her depth. He asked whether she was an attorney. She said no. He asked whether she had formal education in land law. She said no. He asked whether she understood the certified copies could be challenged as to their interpretation. "You're welcome to challenge them," Margaret said. "The interpretation isn't mine. It's in the statutory language of the territorial code, which I can read back to you if it would help." Pressler changed direction. He questioned the barn fire documentation. He suggested it was speculation that a sketch made by a rancher's wife was hardly evidence of arson. "The sketch is supported by the signed statements of 2 witnesses who were present when I made it," Margaret said. "It's also supported by Mr. Whitaker's behavior in the weeks following the fire, including his attempt to settle privately with one of the complaining ranchers, and his foreman's visit to this ranch to issue verbal warnings, both of which are on record." She held Pressler's gaze. "I noted in the case file that I'm not a fire expert. I said what I observed, documented how I observed it, and had witnesses sign the documentation. That's what evidence is." Someone in the gallery made a sound. Judge Beaumont didn't look up from his notes. Pressler tried one more approach. He leaned on the railing with the ease of a man who's done this 1,000 times. "Mrs. Callahan, you arrived in Willow Creek with nothing, no money, no property, no standing. You married a man you'd never met, and within weeks you were pursuing a legal action that stands to benefit your husband financially by hundreds of thousands over time. Is it possible that your motivation here is not the public good you're describing, but your own financial interest in the outcome?" The courtroom was very quiet. Margaret looked at Pressler. "Mr. Pressler," she said, "I arrived in Willow Creek with nothing, as you've said. What I had was the ability to read a land record and understand a number. I used those abilities. If a man with a law degree had done what I did, you would call it thorough preparation of a valid case. You're calling it suspicious because I'm a woman without credentials, and that tells me a great deal about you and nothing useful about the evidence." She didn't raise her voice. As for my financial interest, yes, I am a partner in the Callahan Ranch, which will benefit if we win. So will 4 other families who lost money they earned through years of hard work. The question is not whether anyone at this table has an interest in the outcome. Of course we do. The question is whether the evidence is true. And it is. Pressler stepped back from the railing. He had no follow-up question. Aldrich called the county clerk's assistant last, who testified about the nature of the easement filing and described quietly and precisely the visit he'd received from a man connected to Whitaker's legal team, suggesting his memory of the filing might benefit from some adjustment. That testimony landed in the courtroom like a stone in still water. Whitaker's lawyers put him on the stand. He was composed and gave the performance of a man who has been wrongly accused and is determined to be gracious about it. He explained the easement as a clerical matter. He denied any knowledge of the fire. Aldrich cross-examined him for 45 minutes. By the end, Whitaker's pleasant face had developed a quality it had not had before, the quality of something working very hard to stay in place against pressure it hadn't expected. The jury went out after lunch on the second day. They came back in 2 hours. They found for the plaintiffs on all counts. Ethan sat very still. Margaret beside him sat equally still. Then Dorothy Harrow said something incoherent and grabbed both of them at once, and Pete Harrow was on his feet, and Amos Kettering, who had not shown visible emotion at any point in 2 days of testimony, put his face in his hands for a moment. Ruth Kettering put her arm around her husband. Frank Delacroix looked at the ceiling. Aldrich turned from the plaintiff's table and caught Ethan's eye and gave one short nod. Whitaker sat at the defendant's table with his hat on his knee, and the pleasant face was entirely gone, and what was left without it was smaller than Ethan would have expected. Small and tired and old. Ethan didn't feel what he'd thought he'd feel. He'd spent months carrying a cold, steady anger toward Charles Whitaker, and he'd expected the verdict to release it like a spring trap. Instead, he felt something quieter. Not forgiveness. Not satisfaction either. Something more like the feeling of a debt that's been settled. Done. Filed away. Margaret stood. She smoothed the front of her dress. She picked up the satchel, the same one she'd carried off that wagon the first day, and she looked at him. "Ready to go home?" she asked. Ethan stood. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." They walked out of that courthouse into the October afternoon, and Ethan looked at the sky and thought about his east barn waiting to be rebuilt, and the deed on his kitchen table with 2 names on it, and the woman beside him who had made all of it happen in the space of 4 months, starting from a gray dress and a suitcase, and a dead man's faith that she was worth protecting. "Your father was right," Ethan said. Margaret was quiet a moment. "Which part?" she said. "All of it," he said. "Every single word." She took his arm, not the way she'd taken it at the barn fire, holding on out of urgency, but the way a person takes the arm of someone they've decided to walk beside. And they went down the courthouse steps together into the afternoon, and the valley was waiting for them. The ride back to Willow Creek from Helena took 3 days. On the first night, they camped outside a small town neither of them knew the name of, and Margaret made coffee over the fire, and they sat with the case file between them, not because there was anything left to do with it, but because putting it away felt like a thing that required ceremony neither of them had yet figured out how to provide. The verdict was real. They both knew it was real. But real things sometimes need a night's sleep before they become fully true. "They're going to come to you," Ethan said. "The other women in the valley, when we get back." "Why do you say that?" "Because Dorothy Harrow already told Pete she wants to learn what you did with the records. And Ruth Kettering told Amos she intends to go through their own contracts the same way you went through mine." He looked at her across the fire. "And because word travels in a small valley, and the word that's going to travel from that courtroom is going to be about you. Not Aldrich. Not me. You." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Let them come," she said finally. "I'll teach them everything I know. That's going to make some men in this valley very uncomfortable." "Yes," she said, "it will." And there was no apology in it, and no satisfaction either, just the plain fact of it. the same way she stated everything true. On the second night, Ethan said, "I want to rebuild the barn before the first snow." "I know. It'll take most of November." "I know. I already priced the lumber. It's in the side pocket of the satchel." He looked at her. "I priced it 3 weeks ago," she said. "Before the trial. I didn't want to wait." "You priced the lumber before we knew we'd win." "I priced it because we were going to need a barn regardless of what the judge said." She pulled the satchel closer and didn't look at him. "Winning the case doesn't change the fact that the barn needs a roof, Ethan. Losing it wouldn't have changed it either. The work is the work." He sat with that for a while. "Margaret," he said. "Yes, I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you redirect me to a problem that needs solving." She set the satchel down. She looked at him. "All right," she said. "I know what I said when you arrived. A partnership. Nothing more. Your room, your life, your choice every day." He turned his hat in his hands. "I meant all of it. I still mean it. You've got your choice every morning, same as I said. But I want you to know that my choice has changed." He looked up. "I don't want a business partner, Margaret. I want my wife. Not because your daddy asked me. Not because of the ranch. Because 4 months ago, a woman came to my gate and stood in front of my rifle without blinking, and somewhere between the ledgers and the lawyers, and the way you told Billy not to feel stupid about his math, I fell in love with her, and I'd like to know if she's of any mind to let me." The fire crackled. Margaret sat very still. "You're not a man who says things he doesn't mean," she said at last. "No. You said that to me about my father first week. I've been watching to see if it was true of you too." Her voice was careful the way it got when she was handling something she didn't want to break. "It's true of you." So yes," Margaret said. "I am of a mind to let you." Her voice wasn't quite steady, and she didn't try to make it steady, which was its own kind of answer. "I've been in love with you since somewhere around the night you told Billy to make sure I get the same prices at the Mercantile, if I'm being honest, which seems like the right time to start." Ethan was quiet a moment. "That was in the first month," he said. "I know when it was." "You've been carrying that around for 3 months. I told you I was good at not wanting things," she said. "I got better at it than was probably healthy." Ethan set his hat on his knee. He reached across the fire, not far, not dramatically, and he put his hand over hers on top of the satchel. She turned her hand over and held on the way. She'd held on at the barn fire, except this time there was no urgency in it, just intention. A choice plain and clear. "All right then," he said. "All right," she said. They sat like that a while with the fire between them and the plains around them, and the stars coming up overhead, and neither of them said anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying that night. They came back into Willow Creek Valley on a Thursday afternoon, and the valley was different. Not in any way you could point to easily. The grass was the same, the sky the same, the mountains, the same blue distance they'd always been. But the quality of the air when Ethan drove the wagon through town was different, and he felt it before he could name it the way you feel a change in weather before the first cloud shows. People looked at them. Not the way they'd looked at Margaret when she first arrived, not with the assessing smirk or the pitying tilt of the head. They looked at them the way people look at something they didn't expect and are still working out how to feel about. Mrs. Archer from the Mercantile was on the boardwalk when they came through, and she looked at Margaret, and then she looked away, and then she looked back, and Ethan saw the woman make a decision on her face. She tipped her head. A small thing, but a real one. "Did she just nod at me?" Margaret asked quietly. "She did." "Mrs. Archer, who told the whole town I married you for the land." "The same." Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then, "Well, people can change. Some of them," Ethan said. "The ones worth knowing." At the ranch, Billy was in the yard before they'd stopped moving, which was Billy's way, and he was talking before he'd reached them, which was also Billy's way. "Mr. Aldrich sent a letter ahead," he said, taking the horse's bridle. "Came yesterday, and Pete Harrow came by this morning, left a note. And there's a woman from town, a Mrs. Lester. She sent a pie and asked if Mrs. Callahan could visit when she has a moment. Ethan climbed down. A pie. Apple. It's on the kitchen table. Ethan looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at Billy with the expression she got when she was adding things up in her head. What did Aldrich's letter say? She asked. Something about the court order and an enforcement date. They went inside. Aldrich's letter was on the desk and Margaret read it standing still in her coat, the satchel not yet set down. The court has issued the enforcement order, she said. Whitaker has 30 days to satisfy the damages judgment or the court will begin seizing assets. She looked up. He also says Whitaker's lawyers have filed a notice of appeal. Ethan had been expecting that. How long does an appeal take? Months. Possibly a year. She set the letter down. But the enforcement order stands during the appeal unless the appellate court specifically stays it, which Aldrich says is unlikely given the quality of the record. She turned to face him. He's not going to win the appeal, Ethan. He's filing it to buy time and to make us nervous. Don't let it make you nervous. I'm not nervous, Ethan said. Are you nervous? I've been nervous since Missouri, Margaret said. I've just gotten good at not letting it change what I do. She put the satchel down finally and sat at the kitchen table, and Ethan put the coffee on, because that was a thing he'd learned to do in the months since she arrived. He'd learned to put the coffee on when she sat down with that particular set to her shoulders that meant she was still working through something. The appeal changes the timeline, she said, but it doesn't change the outcome. What it does do is give us time. Time for what? Time to make sure the ranch is completely solid before any of the damages money comes through. I don't want us to build our next 6 months on money that's tied up in appellate proceedings. She pulled the lumber estimate from the satchel's side pocket and set it on the table. Barn first, then the east fence. Then I want to talk to you about the water rights on the north pasture, because if Whitaker ends up selling that land as part of the damages settlement, there's a question about access that we should resolve before someone else buys it. Ethan sat down across from her and watched her move through the problems the way she always moved through problems, fast and methodical and completely without self-pity, about the fact that the problems kept coming. 3 days' ride from Helena, and she was already 3 steps ahead. Margaret, he said. The pie. She looked up. What about it? A woman from town sent you a pie. She looked back at the papers. I heard Billy. That's not nothing. I know it's not nothing. She was quiet a moment. I know what it is. It's the beginning of the town deciding what they think of me now that the verdict is public. Some of them will send pies, some of them will keep their distance, and some of them will be Mrs. Archer on the boardwalk somewhere in the middle working it out. She finally looked up, and he saw on her face what she almost never let him see, the tiredness underneath the competence. I spent 29 years being the woman people decided things about before they met me. I don't need the valley to love me, Ethan. I just need them to deal with me honestly. A pause. The pie is a start. Ethan got up. He cut 2 pieces of the pie and set one in front of her and sat back down. She looked at the plate. The lumber estimate, she said. It'll keep. She picked up the fork. The east barn went up through November. Ethan worked it with Billy and 2 extra hands hired from town. And on the 3rd day, Pete Harrow showed up without being asked. And by the 2nd week, there were 6 men working the rebuild, and Margaret was managing the materials list from the kitchen table, and the barn was fully framed by the 15th. Can I say something, Mrs. Callahan? Billy said the day they raised the last beam. You always do, Billy. When you first got here, I thought whatever the town thought. I was wrong inside the first 2 weeks. He turned his hat in his hands. The night you told me I'd put the inventory numbers in the wrong column, you didn't make me feel stupid. You just showed me how to do it right and moved on. My daddy always made me feel small when I got a number wrong, said I wasn't cut out for figures. He looked at the new barn going up. You showed me different. Margaret looked at him. Your daddy was wrong about you, she said. For what it's worth. Yes, ma'am, Billy said. I reckon he was. December brought the first snow, and the appeal decision came in the 3rd week of January. The appellate court denied Whitaker's appeal in full. Aldrich's letter arrived on a Thursday, the same day of the week that Ethan and Margaret had been married, which neither of them pointed out, but both of them noticed. Margaret read the letter at the kitchen table with the morning's coffee, and then set it in the case file, and closed the file, and set it on the shelf where she kept the finished things. "It's over," she said. Ethan said nothing. "He has to pay," she said. "All of it. Every family. The full judgment plus interest for the months of appeal." Ethan sat down. It had been 6 months since the woman in the gray dress had climbed off a wagon at his gate with his rifle in her face and a dead man's letter in her hand. 6 months since he'd stood on his porch and told her this was a partnership and nothing more, and meant it, and not known then what the word partnership would turn out to mean. 6 months since the barn that now stood solid and new on the east side of the ranch had been a pile of char, and the valley had been in the grip of a man who'd been slowly buying it out from under itself. "Ethan," Margaret said. He looked at her. "Say something." "I don't have the words," he said. "I've been telling you that since you got here. I don't have the words for most of it." "Then say the small thing. Whatever's in your head right now." He thought about it. "I was going to lose this ranch," he said. "Not this year, not next year, but in 5 years, maybe 7. The way Whitaker was working it, I would have lost it. And I didn't know. I knew something was wrong the way you know a horse is off before you can say what's wrong. But I couldn't name it, and I couldn't fix it, and I was just going to keep working and watching it go wrong and not know why." He looked at his hands on the table. "You walked up to my gate, and I pointed a gun at you." "You did," Margaret said. "And now here we are." "Here we are," she said. "I owe Samuel Whitmore more than I thought I did," Ethan said. "I thought I owed him my life from the accident. Turns out I owed him the whole thing. The life I was going to have as well as the life I'd already lived." Margaret was quiet for a long time. "He knew what he was doing," she said finally. "He'd known you for 11 years, even at a distance, and he knew what you were, and he knew what I was, and he sat in his dying, and he thought about it carefully, and he decided we'd be good for each other." She looked at the closed case file on the shelf. "He told me once that the best thing one person can do for another is to see them clearly and love them anyway, not in spite of what they are, just including it." She looked back at Ethan. "He saw you clearly, Ethan, and he saw me, and he thought the two of us together would be more than either of us alone." "He was right," Ethan said. "He was right," she agreed. And then softer, "I wish he could have known." "He knew," Ethan said. "He knew before he wrote the letter. That's why he wrote it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held on. They sat like that for a while. Two people who had each stopped believing in the future and then found it again in the most unlikely of arrangements, in a dead man's faith, and a rifle lowered in a dusty yard, and 4 months of ledgers and lawyers, and 1 apple pie from a woman who'd changed her mind. The town took the better part of a year to fully reckon with what had happened. The woman who'd said in the third pew that Margaret was twice the size of Ethan came to a Thursday morning session in February and sat in the back and didn't speak for 2 hours, and then asked a question about water access rights that showed she'd been paying close attention the whole time. Mrs. Archer at the Mercantile worked her way from a small boardwalk nod to a genuine apology by summer. "I said things about you before I knew you. I was wrong." Margaret thanked her and meant it. People can change. Some of them. The ones worth knowing. The damages judgment came through in full in March. All 5 families paid in the amounts the court had ordered, plus the interest that had accrued through the appeal. Whitaker liquidated 2 of his eastern properties to satisfy the judgment and sold off a portion of his cattle operation. "Men like him don't leave," she said when someone brought it up at one of the Thursday sessions. "They stay and they contract, and over time they become something smaller, and eventually the valley just goes around them like water around a stone. What matters is that he doesn't have the reach anymore. He can't squeeze the small ranches because the small ranches know what he was doing now. Sunlight, as my father used to say, is the best disinfectant. The spring brought planting and cattle and the ordinary urgent business of a ranch moving into its best financial year in a decade. Margaret renegotiated 2 more supply contracts, brought in a 3rd buyer for the cattle, alongside the Billings connection, and spent 3 weeks working with Pete Harrow to document and file a formal challenge to a water claim that a speculator from out of territory had quietly filed on a creek that served 4 ranches. That challenge was resolved in 6 weeks, in the rancher's favor. "You know what you've become," Pete Harrow said to her one afternoon in the spring after the water claim resolution letter arrived. "What's that?" "The person people bring their problems to," Pete said. "A year ago, this valley didn't have anyone like that. Just people fighting their problems alone the way Whitaker wanted it. Now they've got you." Margaret looked at the letter in her hands. She thought about a wagon bench and 400 miles of road and a man she'd never met and a rifle she hadn't known whether to expect or not. "My father would say I stumbled into it," she said. "Did you?" Pete asked. She thought about it. "No," she said. "I think he planned it. He knew both of us, and he trusted what he knew." She set the letter down. He was a plain man. He didn't have much, but he had that. He knew people the way some people can see through weather to what's coming. Pete Harrow nodded slowly. "Sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was the best man I ever knew," Margaret said, "until I met his match." The ranchers who benefited from the verdict would tell you it was about justice and the law working as it should. The women of Willow Creek would tell it differently. They would tell you about the Thursday mornings. Margaret opened the kitchen. The ledger book spread on the long table the way she taught Dorothy Harrow to read a cattle contract and showed Ruth Kettering how to file a water rights claim, and how word spread until women came from ranches a day's ride away. They would tell you about Dorothy Harrow's daughter, 17 years old and wanting to be a lawyer, who got enrollment at a school in Billings. On the strength of a letter, Margaret wrote the first such offer the school had ever made to a female student. And they would tell you about Billy, who turned out to have a head for figures, after all, who became the ranch's business manager by 25, and who always said he had a good teacher, who never once made him feel stupid about what he didn't know. And Ethan would tell it the way Ethan told everything, short and plain, and with the minimum amount of words that could hold the truth. He would say the day Margaret Callahan arrived at this ranch, I aimed a rifle at her. He would say I had not yet learned that the bravest thing a man can do is lower the gun. He would say she taught me that along with everything else. The deed to the Callahan Ranch, filed with the county office in the spring following the verdict, listed 2 names. Margaret held the copy of the deed for a long time the evening it arrived. E. and M. Callahan, she read. In that order, because you said alphabetical was silly, Ethan said. It is silly. My name should be first. Your name is on the deed. My name is on the deed, she said, and something in her voice did what it had done on the night she'd told him she'd been in love with him since the first month, and had carried it alone for 3 months. It went quiet and real, and underneath all the competence, there was the plain human being who had wanted this, and not believed she would have it, and now had it. She set the deed on the table. She turned to face him. And Ethan Callahan, who had once been the loneliest man in Willow Creek Valley, who had built his fence high and kept the gate locked and convinced himself he wanted it that way, looked at his wife in the kitchen of the ranch they both owned and thought about Samuel Whitmore digging him out from under a fallen corral with bare hands and a busted shovel, and about the promise he'd made in a grateful handshake, and about the way that promise had come back to him 11 years later in the form of a woman with a gray dress and a straight spine, and a mind like a steel trap, and a heart that had been waiting same as his for someone willing to see it clearly and love it anyway. He tipped his hat to her. Old habit, old instinct. The gesture that had surprised him the first time he'd done it the night of their first supper, when he'd caught himself doing it and hadn't taken it back. He didn't take it back now either. Mrs. Callahan, he said. She smiled at him. The real one. The one that went all the way up. Mr. Callahan, she said. On a Sunday evening in late May, Ethan found Margaret at his grandmother's grave. She was standing with her hands folded and her head slightly bowed, not praying exactly, just being present in the way she was present at things fully and without distraction. He stood back and let her have the moment. When she turned and saw him, she didn't startle. She never startled. "I was telling her," Margaret said. "Telling her what?" "That her ring is in good hands." She looked down at the plain gold band on her finger. "I've been meaning to come. It felt like something I should do. Introduce myself properly." Ethan walked over and stood beside her at the grave. "She would have liked you," he said. "She used to say that the women who kept this country going were mostly invisible because the work they did got done indoors and in the books and in the holding things together, and nobody writes poems about holding things together." "No," Margaret said. "They don't." They stood a while at the grave, the two of them in the good evening air. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah, I want to write to my father's grave. I want to write him a letter and put it in the ground beside the marker. Tell him what happened." She was looking at the grave. "Tell him he was right. Tell him I found the place. Tell him the ring fits." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Write the letter. I'll ride with you to Missouri when you're ready to take it." She looked at him. "That's a long ride," she said. "It is," he said. "Pack good boots." And Margaret Whitmore, who had become Margaret Callahan on a gray Thursday, in a small church in a valley that hadn't known what to do with her, who had arrived with a suitcase and a dead man's faith, and not one single thing else, who had built a case and won a trial, and rebuilt a barn, and opened a kitchen on Thursday mornings, and taught every woman who came through that door that what she carried in her head was worth more than anything a small world had ever told her to leave behind. Looked at the man who had lowered the gun and smiled, the real smile, the Billings one, the one that went all the way up. "All right," she said. She took his arm, and they walked back to their ranch together in the evening light. Two people who had each been told in their different ways that they were not enough, that they were too much, that love was not for them, and the future was already written, and the gate was closed, and the world had already decided, and who had found each other anyway, across 400 miles, and a dead man's faith, and one perfect letter that had said all the true things a father could say. Some debts don't get settled. They get transformed into something better than what they were. The loneliest rancher in Willow Creek Valley was not lonely anymore, and the woman everyone had underestimated had always known exactly what she was worth. She had just been waiting for the world to catch up,